Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm Tom Glinsky, the Chief Inspector. Today's topic for our webinar is we're going to go over the new drug take-back regulation. It became effective today, so this is good timing. Before we get started, I will just run through some general discussion about the webinar. If you need to be signed in today, you are in listen-only mode, so everyone is muted. If you have any trouble with the audio on your computer, you do have a telephone dial-in option. If you go to webinar toolbar, it gives you the option to click over to telephone and gives you the dial-in number. We are giving 1 hour of CE for today's webinar. You must be officially signed in as an individual and logged in via the computer. If you're in a room and only one person's logged in and multiple ones are watching and listening in, only the one that's logged in will get CE. In order to get CE, you must complete the post-survey questions that come up at the end of the webinar. And we'll have more instructions at the end of the webinar on CE. The CE that we provide is not submitted to the CPE monitor, so make sure you save your certificate when you get it. There's handouts on the board's websites for today's webinar. We will make a recording of this webinar and post it on our website. You can find previous ones under our publication resources page, and then there's a section of all our previous webinars we've done. You do not get any credit for watching one of the recordings. We will take questions at the end of the webinar, time permitting. If you would like to send a question, go to your toolbar and you can type it in and hit send, and we will get them and send it. See what we can answer at the end of the webinar today. So we'll get started today. Again, our objectives is to go over the new rule on, it's basically the collection of medications for destructions, which is, I'm going to just call it as the take-back rule, and then we'll answer questions if we have time. Before we get into the regulation itself, I just give you some history about drug take-back here in the United States. It didn't really become a big popular thing until the DEA got involved. Back in 2010, they started sponsoring National Take-Back Days, and these were 2 days a year. They would hold programs, and these were law enforcement programs, so it was local law enforcement running the programs. DEA was advertising the program and then also handling the destruction for the law enforcement people. Since 2012, they've had 12 events over the years. In 2014, on their announcement for one of the events, they said it would be the final one. However, they have continued to hold them, so I don't know if they will continue to hold them, but at least for this year, they have announced there will be one on April 29th. So you can let your patients, customers know if there is what's available in your area. I found it interesting, some data that DEA has on their website. Occasionally they post state-specific take-back numbers for their program, and I found this one here is from last year, spring of last year, and as you can see here, Missouri is way up there in the number of pounds collected. On this take-back day, Missouri was 5th in the nation on how we're up there with Ohio, Pennsylvania, almost up to where New York is. We exceeded Florida. So you can see there's a lot of take-back going on here in Missouri at the programs. And I thought, well, maybe this was just an anomaly, but I would look back. Missouri's ranking population-wise is, I believe, 18th, but I found 3 different take-back programs where they publish state-specific data, and as you can see, Missouri is always up there in these 3 in the top 10, so it appears Missouri has a higher than average amount of drugs to be destroyed. which goes to the point of why we need pharmacies to be able to be involved in these and not rely solely on law enforcement programs. So I'll give you a history of the regulation. Prior to October 2014, there wasn't any regulations that allowed pharmacies to take back controlled substances. In Missouri, we didn't have any allowance for it. Actually, we actually had a prohibition of pharmacists receiving drugs from anyone other than licensees of the board. So DEA changed their regulations in October 2014 to allow pharmacies to partake in that. They wrote regulations and finalized them in October of that year. It took us, you can see, 2.5 years to get our regulations finalized, proposed finalized, and now, as I said, they became effective today. And then BNDD, because they regulate controlled substances in Missouri, we need to be concerned about what their regulations say about it. And currently, their drug take-back regulations have not been finalized yet. They're in the pending status. So BNDD does not have any specific requirements right now on drug take-back. So the question is, can I accept controlled substances? The Board of Pharmacy rule allows it as long as you comply with both state and federal controlled substance laws. DEA allows it if you follow DEA regulations. So BNDD is where we have kind of an unknown. They have no current regulations related to collections. We know they are working on finalizing some. They currently have a statute that's on the books that says you may only accept what you dispense. So a practitioner, including a pharmacy, can only take back drugs that they dispensed. They informed me that they will require legislation and a statute change in order to allow pharmacies to accept drugs dispensed by others. The statute does not prohibit any kind of prohibit mail-back programs when the drugs are not sent back to the pharmacy. So the statute really doesn't interfere with a program like that where no drugs are coming back to the pharmacy, because the current statute only applies to registrants accepting controlled substances back. So if you are planning on accepting controlled substance, first you must comply with BNDD and DEA requirements. And then our recommendation would be that you notify your patients that you can only accept controlled substances that were dispensed by your pharmacy. We would recommend you put a sign on your receptacle stating such. There are other sign requirements, both by the board and by DEA, but this could be an additional thing you would have on there. And then we suggest that you would consult with legal counsel if you had any questions or need guidance interpreting what DEA requirements or what the current BNDD statute means. So now we'll get into the Board of Pharmacy's regulations. If you'd like to see a copy of this regulation in whole, if you go to our website and go under rules and statutes, there's a link there. It'd be in Chapter 2, and then that will take you to the whole Chapter 2 that will, you can find Section 2.095 and see the whole thing. The board's regulation applies to non-controlled drugs. It applies to non-controlled drugs even when they're commingled with controlled substances. Many of the requirements in the board rule were taken directly from the DEA regulations. So if you're complying with DEA, and they're very, very similar. DEA does have some differences. I will point some of them out later during the program, but many of the board's requirements match exactly what the DEA says. Some of the general requirements in the rule: participation is voluntary. There's nothing that says a pharmacy isn't required to do this. It would be totally up to them if they want to participate. and at what level they participate, if they want to do just non-controls or if they don't want to do both. So it's totally up to the pharmacy. If you are participating, you must follow the regulation. You must follow all state and federal laws. So you have to follow controlled substance laws, so BNDD and DEA, but you also have to follow state and federal laws related to the environmental issues, waste disposal, Department of Transportation if you're shipping or hauling any waste. So there's other regulations besides pharmacy and controlled substance regulations you need to be aware of. I do not go into any of those on this program today. The rule will not affect the current long-term care return and reuse, what's currently going on. We have a rule that spells out how return and reuse is done. It does not affect that. It does not affect any participation in the drug repository programs. For those that may not be familiar with those are a program, and this is regulated by the Department of Health, that allows returns from nursing homes to be processed and donated to indigent programs and other uses for the indigent. Again, this is all under the Department of Health. The regulations are all found there. But our current take-back rule will not affect the drug repository programs if you partake in one of those. The new rule will not affect your involvement if you participate in a law enforcement take-back program. So if you've been currently working with law enforcement on one of the take-back days, it will not prohibit you from doing that. It does put into regulation what we've always told people on guidance on if you are involved in a law enforcement program. I'll talk about that later on in the program. And again, I mentioned earlier, the rule does not require you to separate controls and non-controls. Both can be commingled in your program. So what is not allowed by the rule? You cannot use a return take-back program to dispose of pharmacy inventory such as outdated drug, unused drugs, unwanted drugs, or any kind of waste drugs. These programs are specifically for patients' medications that have already been dispensed, so pharmacy can't use them as an option for disposing of pharmacy inventory. Also, pharmacies are prohibited from reusing or reselling any kind of the collected medications. So the rule talks about two different methods that will be allowed. These are the only two methods allowed. So if you get any kind of proposal from something using other than one of these two methods, they would not be allowed here in Missouri. The first method is a mail-back program, and that's basically a pharmacy can provide envelopes to patients for the patient to mail back stuff directly to a collector who would be destroying it. It would not be going back to the pharmacy. And I'll talk more about both of these methods as we go through the program. The other method is a collection receptacle, and these can be located within a pharmacy, and they also can be located within a long-term care facility. And again, this mimics similar what you see in DEA regulations allowing for receptacles to be at pharmacies and long-term care facilities. So people say, well, what is a receptacle? So here's some pictures of some that I found on the website at various different companies that sell these receptacles. But this is what they look like. They are a securely constructed container with an inner liner container inside. They have some kind of secure opening similar to like a mailbox type setting. There's multiple types of these. These are just a few I found on the internet. And again, the board doesn't recommend any specific brand, but I wanted to show some pictures so you get an idea. It's not a trash can with a bag inside. It's not a 5-gallon bucket with a bag inside. It is a heavily constructed, secure container. And we have specific requirements on that, which I'll go through later. Any pharmacy that's involved in a take-back program, but by either method, needs to have written policies and procedures covering collection and destruction. I spelled out under collection more detailed what needs to be included in your policies and procedures. For collection, you need to explain what kind of program you're doing and talk about your receptacles, security of your receptacles. If you're doing a mail-back program, how that will work. And then for those doing receptacle programs, the storage of the drugs that you bring back, including if you have receptacles out at long-term care facilities, your policies and procedures have to cover those. And then record requirements for both programs. And then, like I said, your policies and procedures need to cover your destruction method that you use. So the rule is very specific, just like the DEA rule is on what a receptacle is and where it can be located. So our rule says it has to be inside the pharmacy building. It has to be securely fastened to a permanent structure. So it would need to be fastened to a wall or a floor, something permanent. It has to be located in the pharmacy so it's visible to pharmacy staff at all times. So if you had it in the waiting area in front of your pickup counter where your staff is, I mean, that would be visible to the pharmacy. It can't be off in a corner that's blocked by, you know, bays of merchandise and stuff like that where you don't have a line of sight. And you cannot have it in or near exit doors. So if you have double doors where you have a little space in between the two doors, you cannot put it inside that space, and it should not be located near doors like your front door. If you're placing a collection receptacle at a long-term care facility, it's kind of similar. It needs to be inside the long-term care facility building. It has to be securely fastened to the structure and visible to the staff. But there is an exemption here, different from pharmacy, that at a long-term care facility, if it's not accessible to the public, you may put the receptacle in a locked or controlled access room or area and not have to permanently fix it to the structure. This only applies to long-term care facilities. That option does not apply to receptacles at pharmacies. And again, a similar one, it's not in or near exit doors. Some more things about the requirements for a receptacle in a pharmacy. It has to be constructed that there's an outer container with an inner liner inside that collects the product. It can't just be a container or that. It must be locked, so to get into, it has compartments in it that have locks on it, so the inner liner, its compartment is locked. The opening has to be constructed so that medication can be added, but nothing can be removed on it. So similar to maybe a post office drop box where you can't reach in and get anything out. If the pharmacy closes and the receptacle is out in an area when the actual pharmacy is closed, so maybe at a larger store where the pharmacy closes at 9, but the rest of the store is open till 10, you must lock the opening or make it inaccessible to the public when the pharmacy itself isn't open. So if you're inside more of a big box store type setting where the pharmacy has different hours, you have to lock your opening and nothing can be dropped off when the pharmacy is closed. And the board requires you put a sign on your receptacles telling you what you accept. If you only accept non-controls, then you would have a sign that says that. Or if you're taking controls, then it says you have to have a sign that's compliant with what DEA requires. And DEA has specific languages what needs to be on your sign for your receptacle. If you have receptacles at long-term care facilities, the pharmacy is responsible for that facility, for that receptacle. It is not the responsibility of the facility. So the pharmacy is in charge of installing, managing, and maintaining the receptacle. The pharmacy is responsible for removing drugs from the receptacle, sealing them up, and the transfer and storage of those drugs collected. A sign is only required if the receptacle is accessible to the public or residents. And again, similar to what's in the pharmacy, the opening must be locked or made inaccessible to the public when the long-term care facility is closed. I'm not really sure when a long-term care facility would be closed, that they didn't have staff there, but in case that ever happened, it would have to be locked. So the liners, these are the collection liners that are inside the receptacle, and these, again, match DEA requirements specific to liners. They must be removable. They must be sealable. You must be able to close them up. They have to be waterproof, tamper-evident, and tear-resistant. You cannot be able to view the contents, so they must be made of a material so you can't view that. And each individual liner has to have a unique number or identifier on them. So these aren't just trash bags you would buy. These are liners that come with some kind of unique number or identifier on them. So liners in pharmacies, for receptacles in a pharmacy, the liners can only be installed or removed by or under the supervision of 2 Board of Pharmacy licensees. And so when I say Board of Pharmacy licensee, that would be pharmacist, intern, or technician. So it has to be one of those 3 are the only people that can be involved in that, and it has to take 2 of them to do that. Now, under the supervision means someone else could do it, but they would still have to be 2 Board of Pharmacy licensees watching that and supervising it. Once the liners are removed, they must be immediately sealed. And there can be no opening of it once it's sealed or any kind of analyzing x-ray. Again, this is all coming similar to what DEA requires. Once removed, you can put your removed sealed liners in a locked cabinet or a controlled access area. And I will talk later about some differences between DEA requirements and the boards, and this is one of them. DEA does not allow for this controlled access area. It strictly says locked cabinet or room, but I'll talk more about that on a later slide. And then once they're removed, they cannot be stored in the pharmacy for more than 30 business days. So you would have to make sure you get your liners, your sealed liners, out of the pharmacy in 30 business days after you remove them and get them sent off for destruction. Liners for receptacles at long-term care facilities. Again, the requirement is it's installed or removed by or under the supervision of 2 Board of Pharmacy licensees, but there's also an or here. You have an option of 1 Board of Pharmacy licensee and 1 long-term care staff member. It doesn't specify what type of staff member. As long as they're employed there at the facility, they can be involved in it. But again, it has to be along with 1 Board of Pharmacy licensee. And again, the same things apply about once removed, you must seal it, and then you can't open it, analyze it, or x-ray it. And once removed, you can store them at the facility in a locked cabinet or controlled access area. And again, the DEA does not allow for this controlled access area. It must be in a locked cabinet or room. And they can only be stored at the long-term care facility for 3 business days after they're removed, and that matches DEA requirement too, of 3 days. But you still could take them, leave them there 3 days, and then take them to the pharmacy and store them there for another 27 days until you send them off for destruction. The board rule does require reporting if you have a theft or diversion of any drugs collected or any of your receptacles are stolen. So within 14 days of learning of that theft or diversion, you must notify the board in writing. You could do that by email, letter, or fax, and just give us the information of what was stolen or diverted, and any details about that, and give us your name and your pharmacy name and address and permit number. Talk a little bit now about the mail-back programs that are allowed. Again, I told you these would be a pharmacy providing the packages, empty packages to the public for the public to put their drugs in and mail back to a destruction site. These can be provided by the pharmacy, or the pharmacy can use a third-party entity to provide these to the public. However, if you use a third-party entity, the pharmacy is still responsible for all the requirements related to the mail-back program. The board's rule says a mail-back package can only be mailed to an authorized collector. An authorized collector is defined as someone authorized by DEA or federal law to accept drugs back for destruction. So these packages would not be being mailed back to a pharmacy unless you had an on-site destruction method. We'll talk more about that on a later slide. And the pharmacy cannot mail packages for the patient. So if a patient brought in their drugs they wanted destroyed, you handed them an empty envelope, they put them in there and sealed it, and then said, here, pharmacy, I'll let you mail it for me or ship it. That's not allowed. The patient themselves has to be the one who is mailing back the package. Some specifics about the package, and again, these also most of these mimic DEA requirements. The envelope must be pre-addressed, and that would be addressed to the authorized collector you're going to send it back they're going to send it to for destruction. It has to be postage and shipping paid. The package itself must be sealable, waterproof and spill-proof, tamper evident, and tamper resistant. And again, similar to the liners, they have to have a unique number or identifier on them so they can be tracked. The mailback packages must include instructions to the patient. And these instructions need to cover the mailing process. It needs to have that it can only be mailed within the 50 states. And that this is the only package that can be used. The patient cannot tear off the label and put it on another package to send back. You must use the package that is provided. So all that needs to be in instructions that is provided to the patient. And the pharmacy cannot require any type of personal information be collected in order for a patient to send back. So you can't ask them to fill out some kind of information, giving them their personal information so it gets included in the package. So no personal information can be collected through this program. So I know people are going to say, well, where do you find these receptacles, liners, and packages? Well, the best I can tell you is do an internet search. That's what I did while I wrote this to see what's out there. And later on, I have a specific pamphlet I found that actually has a list of vendors that I will tell you about. But an internet search, and when you're doing an internet search, if you find receptacles, liners, and mailback packages that are DEA compliant, they will meet Board of Pharmacy requirements. So that's what you should be looking for, is to buy these types of things that meet DEA requirements, and then you shouldn't have a problem meeting the board's requirement. So destruction methods, let's talk first about liners, the sealed liners. How do you go about getting them destroyed? The rule talks about on-site destruction, and if you do on-site destruction, you must meet all state and federal laws, and it must be witnessed by 2 Board of Pharmacy licensees. However, in order to do on-site destruction, you need to meet all state and federal waste laws and environmental laws, and I believe about the only way you'd be able to do this is if you had an on-site incinerator. I'm not giving anyone advice today on what method to use for destruction, but you need to make sure you're following all state and federal laws. I believe the most common method will be you're going to transfer it to an authorized collector for destruction. Again, authorized collector would be someone who is authorized by the DEA or other federal law to accept drugs back for destruction. So reverse distributors are ones that would probably do this. You would want to check maybe with who you're using for your outdated drugs to see if they take back drugs collected through a take-back program. I will tell you, you need to check they may have different requirements, and some may prohibit that because of some of the hazardous waste laws and Department of Transportation laws regarding to hazardous waste. Because it's unknown what's in these packages, other laws may kick in. So don't just ship these to your reverse distributor without first finding out if they will accept them. So you can mail, ship, or transfer them to a collector. But again, two Board of Pharmacy licensees must witness either the shipping, mailing, or pickup. So that means two licensees goes to the post office, FedEx, or the UPS to drop it off. Or when they're picked up, if you haven't picked up at the pharmacy, they must have two Board of Pharmacy licensees witnessing the pickup. If you actually transport these to a destruction site, the rule goes into details about how to do that. DEA goes into details how to do that. But again, two licensees has to go with the product as you drive it to the destruction site. Destruction method for mailbacks, there really is none for the pharmacy. The pharmacy is not involved in any way. The drugs in a mailback program are not coming back to the pharmacy. They're going directly to who would be destroying it. So there is no involvement for the pharmacy on a mailback program destruction. The rule does spell out specific records that the pharmacy must keep, and so does DEA. There are variances here between what's required. I'm going to go through what the board requires here. First, any records required by this rule must be kept for 2 years. The first record that's required is a liner inventory. So if you are participating in a receptacle program, you have to do an annual inventory of your liners. And so every 12 months, you have to count how many empty and sealed liners are in your possession, and that includes both at the pharmacy and at the long-term care facility if you have units there. What needs to be on this inventory is the date of the inventory, the number of liners, and the size. So this most likely, I think, would be maybe in gallons, a 25-gallon liner. I think the way I've seen them listed on the internet, they're using in gallons. And then what unique numbers or identifiers are assigned to those that are currently in your inventory. So this would apply to empty liners that you haven't used, liners that are currently in a receptacle, and liners that are sealed, sitting, waiting for destruction. So once a year, you're going to take an inventory of those. The next record related to liner is just a record of the liner itself. And this, to me, kind of seems more like a perpetual inventory to me when you see some of the stuff that is required. But this is different from the annual inventory required to actually count them every 12 months. This is just a record of what liners you have. So it requires you to have the unique number identifier and size. If it's been installed, you have to put the date the liner installed, the address of where it was installed. So if it either at the pharmacy or at a long-term care facility, what unique number identifier and size was installed, and the names, signatures of the two required witnesses. So not only do you have to have names, whenever you witness something, they're going to have to be signing something because the records require you to have a signature for those. So keep that in mind. And then when a liner is removed, you have to record the date the liner was removed and sealed, the unique identifier of that liner, and then the name signatures of the two required witnesses. So just me trying to think how a pharmacy would do this, I think more like a perpetual inventory with all your liners and their unique numbers, and then have the different sect fields for when it was installed and removed. I will tell you, I saw some of the vendors actually have forms that meet DEA requirements to keep track of some of this stuff. So a vendor might be able to provide you with a sample form to use. But again, if you get something from someone else, make sure it does comply with all our requirements. Other records you're required to have are related to destruction. If you're doing on-site destruction, that you have to record the date, method of the destruction, what liners were destroyed, so that you record the unique number identifier, and then again the name, signature of your 2 witnesses. If you're doing off-site destruction, which I believe would be the most common method, you're going to have the data transfer. That would be the date you either dropped it off at the post office or UPS, FedEx, or if someone came and picked it up, the date they actually picked it up. You're going to record the name and address of who you're using as your authorized collector to do the destruction. You're going to record the unique numbers on the liners, and then again the name and signatures of your 2 witnesses. So I talked earlier about how this does not really affect law enforcement programs, but it does. It doesn't prevent them, but it does put into rule if a pharmacy participates. And these are similar to what we've told people in the past who asked, can I assist, can law enforcement come in on a take-back day and set it up here in the pharmacy? And the answer is yes, they can do it. But if you do it that way or involved in a law enforcement, that this is totally run by the law enforcement. So the collection process and the collected drugs are always under law enforcement supervision. So that means a law enforcement official is always there while the collection is going on, or if drugs are after the collection is done and an hour later the drugs are still there, there's always going to have to be a law enforcement person there supervising the drugs. The pharmacy at no time will take possession of any of the collected drugs. And then law enforcement is the one who must remove them from the pharmacy. Law enforcement is the ones who is overseeing all this and running the show. You're just letting them come in to use your space of your pharmacy area. I want to again, I mentioned earlier how this doesn't affect current long-term care returns. If you're following handouts, this slide is not in the handouts. It's something I added later. But I did want to just re-emphasize that this does not change what's currently going on in long-term care facilities on how they return drugs for return and reuse, or how they destroy their drugs on site. But what it does give a new option for how a long-term care facility can destroy controlled substances on site by putting them in a pharmacy's collection receptacle. This is not mandatory. As far as I know, there is no change in any Department of Health rules requiring this. It's just will be another option on how it can be done versus how they currently destroy. Currently, controlled substances that are not used at the home are not sent back to the pharmacy. They cannot be sent back to the pharmacy. And they're destroyed on site. Well, this would give a new method for doing that. And eventually they would come back to the pharmacy in a sealed liner, and then the pharmacy would be destroyed. So there is a new option here, but again, let me stress, I'm not aware of any new mandates on the homes on how they do their controlled substance returns. Or not returns, but destructions. I'll briefly go over some of the differences between the DEA and the Board of Pharmacy's rule. This is not an inclusive list. If you're going to take back controlled substances, you need to review the full CFR. CFR is the federal regulations on this. So make sure you review that before you start taking back controls. The first thing you have to do is you have to modify your DEA registration prior to starting this. And what that means is the DEA has an online method. It's not getting a new DEA registration. You're modifying your existing one. They have an online mechanism to do that. You're able to go online and modify your registration. Not only do you have to modify it prior to starting, but if you stop participating in a take-back program, you have to notify them of the discontinuation so they can unmodify your registration, I will say. And this includes both if you're doing a receptacle, if you have receptacles in a pharmacy or at a long-term care facility, you have to modify that, and I'm pretty sure, actually I'm positive, you have to notify them when you do the modification of where the addresses, I believe, of the long-term care facility are, where you're going to have your receptacles. You also have to modify it if you're participating in a mail-back program for controls. The DEA has a similar thing to what we call the waiver process, that a pharmacy cannot employ or have employees that have previous felony controlled substance convictions or had previous DEA registrations denied or revoked. They have now added that no employee involved in a take-back program can have that. So again, if you're using people in any method other than pharmacy you're currently covered under your pharmacy, you need to review that because this is expanded to that. It's my understanding that there's still a waiver process similar to like your pharmacy employees. If you want to request a waiver for an employee, you can, but this is something new. The board does not have any such requirement like this. The DEA is very specific on who can put the drug in the receptacle. Only the ultimate user, or if you read the rule, or someone who is representing a deceased ultimate user can place the drug in the receptacle. So DEA is specific on this. The board does not have any specifics on who can place the drug in the receptacle, but for controlled substances, the DEA is specific on this. And I talked about previously that the DEA also requires a sign. If you're doing controls, you're not going to have the board sign on there saying you only take non-controls, but they have a sign with specific wording on what has to be said on that sign about what controls you take. Some other differences, and I mentioned this earlier in the program, that sealed liners must be stored in a locked cabinet or room, and that's both in the pharmacy and at the long-term care facility. The board added being able to store them in a controlled access area. The DEA does not allow that, so sealed liners have to be stored locked in a cabinet or a room. And then there are different records requirements. Actually, the DEA requires some more things to be recorded for liners, so you want to look at that if you're doing a receptacle program. And then the board doesn't have any requirement for mail-back package records, but the DEA does. So you want to look at the DEA regulations to make sure you're complying with those. So if you want to see the DEA regulations, they created a new section. It was 1317 that is the bulk of the new regulations. However, scattered throughout the other existing regulations, they made revisions that talk about collections. So I believe there are 5 or 6 other sections besides 1317 that were modified. So you need to look at all these. And the best way to see these is if you go to the Federal Register, September 9, 2014, and here's a link to it here, where they published the answers to the comments that they got on the rule. At the end of that, they list all the modifications they made to the rule. And so if you go to page 41 of the above link, it starts with a listing of all the modifications they made. That is the easiest way to see that. If not, you would have to read the whole CFR to find out and hopefully catch all the ones where they mention things related to take back. So I would highly recommend that you go to this Federal Register and see that. The DEA does have a website, a page specifically related to drug disposal. That's where you can get the link to the Federal Register that I just talked about, and then they have a variety of other resources on there, and then the links for modifying your DEA registration are on this page too, about half. Right above where it says drug disposal fact sheets, right above that tells you how to modify your registration. Other resources, doing internet search is what I kind of did to make this, to see what was out there. So an internet search. Other boards of pharmacy, some of them have put other guidance out there. I will caution you, make sure you're complying with the Missouri Board of Pharmacy, but some of them have some general programs, documents out there to assist you, and most of them were related, that I saw were related to complying with DEA. They pretty much just adopted DEA requirements. Vendors, I noticed some of the vendors have publications and documents to help comply, but again, these are mainly all DEA requirements, so just make sure you're also complying with the Missouri Board of Pharmacies. And then there's some other organizations out there that have put out resources about drug take back, and I found this one. It's put out by the Product Stewardship Institute, and it's basically, it must be a New York-based thing because a lot of the stuff in it was related to things going on in New York. But I thought it was a very good program telling you, it's basically for a pharmacy, telling you how to go through it. But again, it is based on DEA requirements. But at the end of this, in the appendix, they do have some list of vendors that might be helpful for people trying to locate who sells these receptacles or liners, or who does mail-back programs, where can you buy the envelopes. So that's why I put that on there. They do have that at the back of in the appendix. So again, I put the link for it here at the bottom. So that concludes what I have prepared for the rule. We're now going to see about answering some of the questions that we got. So hold on just a minute while we convert over. Okay. We got a question about our pharmacy does not have a public space to put a receptacle. Can we put the receptacle behind the counter and have staff collect the drugs from the patient and put them in the receptacle for them? The answer is the Board of Pharmacy would allow that, but DEA would not allow that. So if you were only taking non-controls, the Board of Pharmacy rules would allow that, but if you're taking controls, only the patient can place the drug, the ultimate user is how it's worded, can place the drugs in the receptacle. So no, that would not work if you were doing controlled substances. Can you use a receptacle that does not have a liner that gets destroyed with the drugs, like a Sharps container? The answer would be no. The receptacle has to have an outer container with an inner lining, so a Sharps container would not, a Sharp container that you mail off to be destroyed would not work. Does the long-term care option of the receptacle in a locked room instead of fastening to the structure apply to retail pharmacies? The answer is no. That option is only for long-term care facilities. One company offers a drive-through receptacle. Let's see, opening on outside a building, but the receptacle is inside the building. Does this qualify? I think what you're describing is maybe like a night deposit box at a bank, maybe, that the opening's on the outside, what you put in there then drops into the inside of the building. Does that qualify? It would qualify for the Board of Pharmacy, but I do not know if it would meet DEA requirements. So the answer is, I think you would need to research with DEA if that would qualify for them. And again, it would go back to that when the pharmacies close, if you were doing that under Board of Pharmacy rules, you would have to you would have to close the opening when the pharmacy's closed. It'd have to be some way because drugs cannot be dropped off when the pharmacy's closed. So you need to research this before you buy one of those and install that receptacle. Can a pharmacy take the drugs they collect to a law enforcement take-back program for destruction? That's a good question. That's come up over the years over pharmacies taking their out dates and stuff like that to law enforcement. The answer, the Board of Pharmacy would prohibit that, in that you can only send your take-back drugs to someone who is authorized to destroy them. So law enforcement's not actually destroying them, they're just collecting them and then going to send them on somewhere else for destruction. So the Board of Pharmacy's rule would not allow that. And the DEA would not allow that either. If you look at the DEA requirement, this is why if you're doing controls, you really got to go to the DEA requirements. They have specific ways on how pharmacies can destroy drugs, and that would not be one of them. So the answer is no, you can't use law enforcement programs as your destruction method. Can you further explain liners must be sealed? That means they're closed up some way, and in the way they're closed, they would have to be tamper evident. So I could envision like a seal that has some kind of seal that you seal it up with adhesive or something, or I know there's some, I believe, that sell like the tie that goes around like a bag is numbered, so you would know if it was removed and someone put a different one on. But there would have to be some way that you seal it and that it is tamper evident, that you would know if someone got into it. So on that, but it must be sealed immediately. As soon as the liner comes out, you have to seal it. You can't. If you're at a long-term care facility taking one out of a receptacle there, you can't say, well, I'm going to take it back to the pharmacy and we'll seal it up there. You can't take your drugs out there and then say, well, I'm going to take them back and put them in the pharmacy's receptacle or add it to a liner there. You have to seal them immediately. So that also goes along with sealing. But I don't have any more specifics. Just trying to twist you around it like you do a trash bag would not be tamper evident. Someone's asking if your program states that you only do non-controls, but someone puts in a control medication, they're really asking, could you incur a fine or penalty? Well, the board doesn't fine and we don't have penalties. So, but you might be violating controlled substance laws. So I really can't answer that because you then jumped over into the realm of controlled substances and how they're destroyed and stuff. So this goes back again to, you need to clearly explain to your patients, customers, that you only take non-controlled. Someone's asking, can the controlled access locked room, does it have to be different from the room where you lock? I think what they're asking is, can the liners be in the same locked room where the receptacle is? And the answer would be yes, but it has to be in that locked room. You pretty much dedicated the receptacle to being in a locked room, so if you took the liners out of them and let them in there, and they still would be considered in the locked room. Someone's wanting to know, is weighing collected medications considered a type of analyzing? That's a good question. I would say probably not. They're going to get weighed when you mail them and stuff like that, but I don't know. But I can't speak for the DEA. I can speak for the board. I don't think we would have an issue with that. But the DEA has a very similar language, and if you're doing controls, you would need to make sure you're complying with them. Someone's asking, could you have a receptacle that's under continuous video surveillance, and would that meet the requirement? Well, as long as it's that surveillance, that the monitor is visible to the pharmacy staff. But I will just tell you in general, when we see security monitors, there's usually no one ever looking at them. So I would. If it's viewed all the time, yes, but I think you might have issues on meeting that part of the requirement. Someone wants to know, what are the penalties for non-compliance with the guidelines? Well, these aren't guidelines, these are regulations, so the same penalties would apply to non-compliance with any regulation. The same thing would apply to any board requirement, which would be, you could get written up on an inspection, you could be issued a compliance notice, you could get a letter from the board office, all the way up to some kind of public discipline. We have lots of questions that we're not going to get to today. Since this is a new regulation, we got lots of questions. A lot of questions coming from hospitals on where would it be in a hospital. Well, the board's rule requires it to be in line of sight of the pharmacy. So if it's accessible, so it would have to be in line of sight, and I don't know how hospitals will do that since a lot of the pharmacies really aren't in a public area in the hospital. But our rule would require it to be in line of sight. Someone's asking about when I mentioned that if you use a third party to hand out your take-back envelopes, what do I mean by the pharmacy is responsible? Well, the pharmacy is responsible that those envelopes meet all the requirements, the physical requirements, the address requirements, the prepaid requirements. It would also require that the pharmacy have a policy and procedure on their program. So those are the types of things that a pharmacy would be required to have. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We still have a lot of other questions, but we're not going to get to them today. Before I go, I just want to announce, we've been announcing that there will be a drug diversion conference in Kansas City on May 5th. For those on the St. Louis side, we held one last fall at Stillcop. And we're going to do one on the Kansas City side. We're going to be talking about pharmacy diversion. So this is pharmacy diversion within the pharmacy by employees or other methods. We have DEA, BNDD. We have Dr. Shelley coming. Dr. Shelley has done research She's interviewed people in jails and prisons who are there for related to pharmacy robberies, burglaries. She has a lot of, it's a very interesting speech program on why they chose the pharmacy they did and stuff like that. I'll be giving a program too on some tips we have to help prevent diversion in pharmacy. So again, that'll be May 5th. It's a Friday. You will get 5.5 hours of CE for going to that. And so if you go to our web page, our home page, there's a link for that. The next Lunch with the Chief webinar we're not setting dates anymore in advance. We're just going to announce them on email alerts, usually about 30 days prior to them happening. So just watch for our email alerts in the future for the next one. I will tell you, if you're not getting our email alerts, there's been some changes in that. If you're not getting email alerts anymore and they're not in your junk mailbox, then you should go re-sign up again on the board's website. We are using a different program to send them out now, and some people have stopped getting them, so you want to re-sign up if you're not getting our email alerts. So for the continuing education, when I say I'm going to close the webinar, a screen will pop up that says the webinar has ended. On that screen, click the close button, and then a survey of 5 questions will pop up. If the questions do not pop up and you don't get them, you can email us at pharmacy@per.mo.gov and just say you didn't get the questions, and we will email them to you. If we do email them to you, you must get the answers back within 48 hours. We will be mailing out CE certificates. I usually say 30 days. The office is short-staffed right now. It may be longer than that, and we also will be posting a recording of the webinar. It may be longer than 30 days, though. So thank you today for participating in our webinar, and have a good afternoon. I'm going to close the webinar.